If you enjoy videos like this, subscribe to the channel before the video starts. It was a quiet, sunny morning in the small neighborhood of Maplewood. Birds were singing, the lake sparkled under the golden sunlight, and the streets were empty except for a few early walkers. Everyone knew everyone here, or at least, they thought they did. But for the narrator, life in Maplewood had always been calm, peaceful, and private. That is, until Karen arrived. Karen was the kind of person who noticed every little thing. Every crack in the sidewalk, every leaf in the yard, every pebble near the lake. She had been living in Maplewood for a few years, and everyone already knew her reputation. People called her HOA Karen, because she was in charge, or at least, she thought she was of enforcing every little rule in the neighborhood. She had a sharp voice and sharp eyes, and she always believed she was right. The narrator was different. They liked their privacy, enjoyed peaceful mornings by the lake, and never caused problems. But that morning, they were about to face a problem bigger than any they had ever imagined. Karen walked up to the narrator's property, carrying her usual clipboard and wearing the determined, serious look she always had. Her eyes immediately focused on the lake behind the narrator's house. She stopped at the fence and glanced around, making sure no one else was watching. Then she called out, loud and clear. "Good morning. I noticed you have lake access here. I'd like to use it, if that's okay." The narrator looked up from their coffee, sitting calmly on the porch. Their eyes met Karen's, and they smiled politely. But there was a quiet strength in that smile, something that made Karen pause for just a moment. "I'm sorry," the narrator said slowly. "But that's private property. You can't use it." Karen's eyes widened slightly. She had expected a different answer. Most people, she thought, would quickly agree with her requests. She liked to get what she wanted, and she didn't like being told no. Her voice rose a little as she tried to sound firm. "Oh, come on. It's just a little access. You don't mind sharing, do you? It's not like it's a big deal." But the narrator stayed calm. They sipped their coffee, their expression unchanging. "I'm sorry," they repeated. "I said no." Karen's face turned red, not just from anger, but from disbelief. She couldn't understand how someone could simply refuse her. She had always been in control, always the one setting rules, and here was someone standing in her way, quietly and confidently. Karen leaned closer to the fence. "Look, I think you don't understand. I live here, too. I have every right to use the lake, and the HOA agrees with me. You don't want trouble, do you?" The narrator shook their head gently, still calm. "I don't want trouble either. But my answer is still no." For a moment, Karen didn't speak. She blinked rapidly, trying to process what had just happened. Nobody had ever said no to her before. She was used to people agreeing, bending, and sometimes even apologizing for not thinking of her first. But now, she was faced with someone who didn't even flinch. Someone who didn't even hesitate. Karen's hand twitched as she gripped the fence. "You can't do this. You have to let me in," she said, trying to assert her authority. The narrator leaned back in their chair and crossed their arms. "I can. And I won't." The words were simple, plain, and calm. But they hit Karen harder than any shout could have. Her eyes narrowed. She looked around, almost hoping someone else would come by and back her up. But the street was empty. No witnesses. Just her, the narrator, and the sparkling lake. Karen's mind started racing. She didn't like being told no. She didn't like losing control. And she certainly didn't like being ignored. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and said with forced politeness, "Well, maybe I'll talk to the HOA. They'll know what to do." The narrator smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "That's your choice," they said. Karen turned and walked away, her heels clicking loudly on the pavement. But as she left, she kept looking back, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and curiosity. She had a feeling this was not going to end easily. As she disappeared around the corner, the narrator leaned forward slightly, their gaze fixed on the lake. There was a quiet satisfaction in that moment. They knew something Karen didn't, something very important. Something that would change everything if she ever found out. Little did Karen know, this lake was not just a piece of land. And the narrator was not just a quiet neighbor who liked peace. There was power here, hidden behind calm words and quiet mornings. And very soon, Karen would learn exactly how wrong she had been to think she could intimidate anyone, especially this neighbor. For now, the neighborhood stayed quiet. Birds sang, leaves rustled, and the sunlight reflected off the lake. Everything seemed normal. But the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The narrator took another sip of their coffee and smiled faintly. She has no idea, they whispered to themselves. And that simple thought, that quiet, almost invisible smile, was the first sign of what was to come. Because Karen was about to find out something she would never forget. Something that would turn her world upside down. And the narrator? They were ready for it. The morning ended quietly, but the story was only beginning. The day after their first encounter, the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't loud or chaotic, but a subtle tension hung in the air, almost invisible but impossible to ignore. Birds still sang, leaves still rustled, and the lake sparkled as if nothing had changed. But inside Karen's mind, everything had shifted. Karen paced in her living room, clutching her clipboard like it was a shield. Her mind replayed the scene from yesterday over and over. How could someone just refuse me? She muttered. Nobody refuses me. Nobody. She was obsessed. Her thoughts circled around the lake, the property, and that calm, knowing smile of the narrator. She couldn't understand it. Nobody talked to her like that, nobody stood up to her so quietly, so confidently. And the way the narrator said no, it wasn't just a word. It was a warning, a challenge, a secret hiding behind calmness. Determined, Karen decided she needed more information. She started with her usual tricks, talking to neighbors, casually asking questions, pretending it was casual curiosity. Oh, does the lake belong to them? I thought it was communal, she asked, but every answer seemed vague, like people were dancing around the truth. The more she asked, the more frustrated she became. There was something off. Something she couldn't see clearly yet, but it was there. The narrator wasn't just polite. They weren't just private. They were untouchable. Later that afternoon, Karen drove slowly past the narrator's house, pretending to check on the neighborhood. But her eyes were locked on the lake, on the fences, on every detail. That quiet morning, that simple no, had sparked a fire in her. And the fire wasn't going out. Meanwhile, the narrator watched silently from the porch. They noticed Karen's car, saw her pacing, saw her glances. And they smiled. A quiet, subtle smile. The kind of smile that said, "You have no idea what's coming." By evening, Karen's investigation grew bolder. She started looking at public records, searching online for property deeds, ownership details, anything that could explain how the narrator had the right to say no. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through documents, her eyes widening with every line she read. Something was strange, something she didn't understand yet. The narrator, meanwhile, carried on with their calm routine. They watered the plants, sipped coffee, watched the lake. To an outsider, everything looked normal. Peaceful. Perfectly ordinary. But there was an undercurrent of tension, like calm water hiding strong currents beneath. That night, Karen couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the narrator, the lake, and that smug calmness. She whispered to herself, who do they think they are? How can they be so untouchable? And deep down, she had a feeling. A small, nagging thought at the back of her mind that she couldn't shake. There was more to this neighbor than met the eye. And if she could just figure it out, maybe then she could regain control. But she couldn't. The narrator had already won the first battle. And Karen didn't even realize it. The tension of that evening lingered into the night. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. Inside Karen's house, she plotted, schemed, and worried. She didn't know what the narrator was hiding, but she was desperate to find out. And the narrator? They watched quietly from the shadows of their porch lights, knowing that Karen was stepping into a trap she didn't even see. A trap built not with threats, not with power, but with something far more subtle, calm, quiet control. Tomorrow, Karen would make her move again. She always did. She couldn't resist. But the narrator was ready. Because in this quiet neighborhood, calmness was more powerful than anger. And secrets, once revealed, could change everything. The next morning, Maplewood looked the same as always. The sun glittered on the lake, children biked along the streets, and the neighborhood seemed peaceful. But beneath the surface, a storm was quietly brewing. Karen woke up early, her mind restless. She couldn't stop thinking about yesterday, the calm refusal, the simple no, the way the narrator didn't even flinch. She felt humiliated, angry, and most of all, curious. There was something hidden behind that calm face, something she couldn't yet see. Determined to find answers, Karen started her investigation in a way she had never done before. She went beyond casual neighborly questions. She checked property records online, scrolling through endless documents and tax records. She compared addresses, ownership history, and even small details like easements and rights of way. Her fingers trembled slightly as she realized something strange. There were unusual details in the records, details that didn't make sense. "What is this?" she whispered to herself. "How can one person?" The more she dug, the more puzzled she became. The narrator's name was everywhere, but not in the way she expected. The deeds, the property lines, the ownership, they hinted at something far bigger than a single house. Karen's eyes widened. The idea that this neighbor could simply refuse her lake access began to make sense, in a terrifying way. Meanwhile, the narrator noticed subtle signs of Karen's intrusion. They saw her car parked near the edge of the property, her shadow lingering around corners, and the way she peeked at documents that weren't hers. But instead of confronting her, the narrator stayed quiet. Calm. Observant. Every step Karen took, the narrator anticipated, like a chess player waiting for the right move. Karen grew bolder. She tried to talk to other neighbors again, asking about property ownership casually, dropping hints, pretending not to know the truth. But everyone seemed hesitant, nervous even. "I'm not sure, or I don't think that's right," they said. Their eyes avoided hers. Something was stopping them from telling her the whole story. Frustration bubbled in Karen's chest. She clenched her fists. "Why is nobody helping me? Why is this so hidden?" Her obsession turned into desperation. She wanted to know the full truth now. She drove past the narrator's house multiple times, peeking through blinds, checking every angle of the lake, every fence line. She even tried to find a way to enter the property unnoticed. Every glance, every detail, only made her curiosity stronger and her anxiety higher. Back on the porch, the narrator watched her quietly. They had seen this coming, of course. The small hints of fear and frustration, the repeated glances, the subtle hesitation in her steps. They knew Karen was getting closer, closer than she realized, but she had no idea what she was about to uncover. The narrator picked up a small notebook from the table, scribbled a few notes, then set it down with a calm, deliberate motion. The lake sparkled behind them. To anyone else, it was just a beautiful morning. But Karen, blinded by obsession, didn't see the invisible threads connecting everything, the real control, the quiet power, the hidden secrets. That evening, Karen sat in her living room, staring at the documents she had collected. Lines of ownership, block after block, addresses after addresses, it all pointed to something unbelievable. Her breath caught. Could it be possible? Could one neighbor actually own more than she imagined? Her hands shook as she scrolled through more records. The pieces were starting to fit together. Something that had seemed impossible yesterday now felt frighteningly real. And in the back of her mind, a cold feeling settled in. She might have underestimated the narrator. Deeply. Dangerously. Meanwhile, the narrators sipped their evening tea, watching the sunset over the lake. They knew Karen's investigation was coming closer to the truth. And they also knew the moment she discovered the full reality, everything would change. Karen would realize that her anger, her threats, her attempts to control, they meant nothing. The narrator smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if the sun itself had shared a secret with them. And in that quiet smile was a promise: whatever happened next, the balance of power in Maplewood was about to shift forever. Outside, Karen muttered under her breath, "Something is off, there's more here than I can see. But I'll find it. I have to." She didn't know yet that the truth, when revealed, would leave her speechless, powerless, and stunned. And the narrator? They were already ready. Calm, quiet, unshakable, watching the storm of Karen's obsession build, knowing the perfect moment to strike or to let her fall into her own realization was coming soon. Maplewood woke up to a quiet morning. The sun reflected off the lake in golden streaks, and a gentle breeze moved through the trees. Everything seemed ordinary, but for Karen, ordinary no longer existed. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, suspicions, and a gnawing frustration she couldn't shake. After days of poking through records and asking questions, Karen finally found something, a small, almost overlooked detail buried in a public record. It was a property deed, old but still valid, and it mentioned the narrator in a way she had never noticed before. Her eyes widened as she read and reread the lines. "This can't be, it doesn't make sense," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She scrolled further and realized the deed was connected not just to the narrator's house, but to multiple properties on her own street. Her heart began to pound. Karen's fingers shook as she traced the block on her map. Every line, every address, it all pointed back to the narrator. Slowly, a terrifying thought began to take shape in her mind. The calm neighbor she had confronted, the one who had refused her, might own more than just the lake property. Her mind raced. No, it can't be. This has to be a mistake. But deep down, a chilling feeling settled in her chest. She had underestimated this neighbor. The refusal, the calm demeanor, it was a warning she hadn't understood. Meanwhile, the narrator noticed Karen's unusual behavior. From the porch, they saw her pacing, muttering to herself, looking at papers, and retracing her steps again and again. Instead of confronting her, the narrator simply leaned back in their chair, a faint smile on their lips. Inside the narrator's mind, everything was quiet, controlled. They knew Karen was getting closer to the truth. They had allowed her curiosity and pride to lead her this far. And now, she was about to stumble upon something she could never have imagined. Karen's obsession intensified. She started cross-checking the deed with every property on the block, tracing every corner, measuring distances, comparing ownership histories. Each new confirmation only deepened her disbelief. The narrator wasn't just a neighbor, they had a silent control over the entire block. The realization hit Karen like a cold wind. Her voice dropped to a whisper, "All this time. I've been fighting for something that wasn't even mine to claim?" At that moment, the quiet lake reflected a sunbeam straight into the narrator's eyes. They took a slow sip of coffee, their expression calm, almost playful. The perfect tension had built. Karen was right on the edge of discovering the full truth, and the narrator had been watching it unfold all along. Karen felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to confront, to demand answers, but something in the narrator's posture, the calm certainty, stopped her. For the first time, she hesitated. She realized that brute force, anger, or intimidation would no longer work here. She was out of her depth. The narrator knew that all they had to do now was wait. Let her realize the full extent herself. Every flicker of confusion, every gasp of disbelief, every muttered impossible was music to their calm, strategic mind. As the day faded into evening, Karen sat in her car, staring at the narrator's house, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The papers, the deeds, the undeniable evidence, they all pointed to one terrifying fact: the narrator owned the very ground she lived on. And the narrator? They stepped back into the shade of the porch, almost invisible in the fading light, sipping their tea. Calm. Untouched. Silent. Yet fully in control. For Karen, the realization was only beginning to sink in. The calm refusal, the quiet smile, the unshakable demeanor, it all made sense now. But the full weight of the truth, the power hidden behind that calm, would hit her soon. And when it did, Maplewood would never feel the same. The next morning, Karen couldn't sleep. She had spent the entire night staring at the property records, the deeds, and the maps she had painstakingly collected. Her mind was a whirlwind of disbelief and anger. How could one person have so much control? How could they remain calm, unshaken, untouchable? Determined to confront reality, Karen grabbed her papers and drove to the narrator's street once again. She needed to see the properties herself, to confirm that the unimaginable was true. Every house she passed, every corner she turned, her anxiety grew. Something deep inside warned her this was bigger than she had imagined. When she finally stopped outside the narrator's house, she took a deep breath. Her hands shook, not from fear of the narrator but from the realization of what she was about to uncover. She walked slowly along the street, comparing deeds to actual homes, double-checking every number, every boundary line. And then it hit her. Her eyes widened. She gasped quietly. The narrator wasn't just the owner of the lake access, they owned her entire block. Every property she had thought was independent, every home she had believed was under the HOA's control, was under the silent ownership of the neighbor she had underestimated. Karen's knees nearly buckled. She sank onto the curb, clutching her papers as if they were fragile glass. Her mind raced. No, this can't be, it's impossible. How could I have been so blind? Every argument she had ever made, every threat she had ever planned, every complaint to the HOA, it had all been meaningless. The narrator had not just refused her access politely, they had controlled the entire battlefield from the start. And she hadn't even known. Meanwhile, the narrator watched from their porch, calm and composed. Their eyes followed her movements, noting every gasp, every faltering step. They sipped their coffee slowly, savoring the moment, not out of cruelty, but out of quiet satisfaction. This was the moment Karen's arrogance would meet reality. Karen scrambled to her feet. Her voice trembled as she muttered, "All this time. I've been fighting for nothing," her pride, her fury, her obsession all crashing down around her. The street she had walked so confidently now felt like foreign ground. She realized she had never truly been in control. The narrator stood up slowly and walked toward the edge of the porch. Their presence was calm, yet magnetic, commanding without a single raised voice. Karen froze, unable to look away. The realization that this neighbor, whom she had thought ordinary, had all the power, hit her like a thunderbolt. I didn't know," Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. She wanted to argue, to deny, to claim some control, but the words caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her. The narrator smiled faintly, the kind of smile that was both kind and knowing. "Now you see," they said softly. "It's not about the lake. It's about understanding what's yours, and what isn't." Karen's eyes darted around, looking for support, for help, for some loophole. But there was none. Every house, every street corner, every deed she had hoped would give her leverage, it all belonged to the narrator. A cold chill ran down her spine. She had underestimated not just the narrator's power, but their patience, their planning, their quiet dominance. And the realization sank in, she was utterly powerless. The narrator took a slow step forward, letting the sunlight catch the edges of the porch, casting a long shadow over the street. "Sometimes," they said, their voice calm, deliberate, "the person you think is ordinary, is the one holding everything you never expected." Karen sank back onto the curb, staring at the ground. She could hardly breathe. The world she had thought she knew, her neighborhood, her control, her pride, had been completely turned upside down. And the narrator? They turned back toward the lake, unbothered, calm, untouchable. Their secret, their power, their patience, it had all been in plain sight. Karen had just finally seen it. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. The lake glimmered, reflecting the golden light of the morning. Maplewood was quiet again, but nothing would ever feel the same. Karen's world had shifted in a single morning. And for the narrator, it was just another day. The sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across Maplewood's quiet streets. The lake sparkled in the fading light, but the calm beauty of the neighborhood was a sharp contrast to the storm raging inside Karen. She sat on the curb, papers scattered around her, heart pounding. Her mind was spinning with disbelief. Every plan, every complaint, every attempt to control the situation had failed. The realization that she had been fighting someone far beyond her understanding hit her like a punch to the chest. Meanwhile, the narrator stepped onto the porch, calm as ever. They didn't raise their voice, didn't shout, didn't threaten. They simply walked slowly, measured their steps, and spoke with a quiet authority that seemed to command the entire block. "You see, Karen," the narrator said softly, "it's not about who yells the loudest. It's about understanding your place, and respecting boundaries." Karen's hands shook. I just wanted the lake," she stammered. Her confidence, her arrogance, her usual control all crumbling before her eyes. The narrator took a slow sip of tea and smiled faintly. "The lake isn't yours to claim," they said. "And neither is control over what you don't understand." Karen's shoulders slumped. She opened her mouth to argue, to insist, to regain any shred of power, but no words came out. Every argument she had prepared dissolved into nothing. She was powerless. And she knew it. For the first time, Karen realized that the quiet neighbor she had underestimated was not only in control of the lake but also of the entire block she had lived on with such confidence. The houses she thought were independent, the rules she thought she enforced, the influence she thought she had, it all belonged to the narrator. She wanted to run, to escape, to hide from the truth. But the narrator didn't move aggressively. They didn't need to. Their calm, measured presence was enough to hold the entire block in check. Karen felt it in her chest, a pressure she couldn't fight, a control she couldn't touch. "You've spent so much time trying to enforce rules, Karen," the narrator continued, "but rules without understanding are meaningless. And anger without perspective is exhausting." Karen stared at the narrator, wide-eyed. She had never felt so small, so powerless. All the energy she had spent trying to control others had been wasted. She realized something even deeper. She had been playing a game she didn't even know the rules of. The narrator stepped back onto the porch, their gaze sweeping the street, the houses, the lake. Calm. Unshaken. Untouchable. Karen felt a chill. For the first time, she understood the true power of someone who never lost their composure, someone who never overreacted, someone who could silently dominate a situation simply by existing in their calm. Karen sank further, defeated. Her plans, her complaints, her entire persona of control, it was gone. And the narrator didn't gloat, didn't laugh. They simply waited, letting Karen absorb the truth fully. The power had shifted completely. Karen had been so obsessed with the lake, so obsessed with rules, that she hadn't realized she had walked into a situation she could never win. And now, standing silently on the porch, the narrator had won not through threats, not through confrontation, but through quiet, absolute control. The lake shimmered in the evening light, the breeze whispered through the trees, and the neighborhood remained calm. But Karen's world had changed forever. She had learned, too late, that appearances could be deceiving, and that sometimes, the quietest person holds the most power. The narrator sipped their tea one last time, looked at Karen with a faint, knowing smile, and sat back in the chair. They didn't need to act further. The lesson had been delivered. The power shift was complete. Karen looked around helplessly. She had been obsessed with control, but now she understood the futility of it. She had underestimated the wrong person, and the consequences were clear. She had no influence here anymore. And for the narrator, life returned to its quiet rhythm. Calm mornings, peaceful afternoons, and the silent satisfaction of knowing that in Maplewood, true control was theirs and had always been. The evening sky painted Maplewood in shades of gold and pink. The lake reflected the fading sunlight, rippling gently as if nothing had happened. But for Karen, the world had shifted irreversibly. She sat quietly on the curb, staring at the row of houses she had once thought she controlled. Every argument, every complaint, every plan, it was meaningless now. The realization of her own powerlessness weighed heavily on her. She had obsessed over rules, over lake access, over control, but she had failed to see the true power in calmness, patience, and foresight. The narrator stepped onto the porch, their presence calm and unassuming, yet commanding in its quiet authority. They looked at Karen, not with malice, not with gloating, but with a faint, knowing smile. The kind of smile that says, "I told you so," without ever saying a word. "You've learned something today," the narrator said softly, their voice like the whisper of the wind over the lake. Power isn't always loud. Control isn't always visible. Sometimes, the strongest position is quiet, steady, and unshakable. Karen's voice was barely a whisper. I understand now. But even as she said it, she felt the weight of her own mistakes, the pride, the obsession, the inability to see beyond the surface. The narrator leaned back, eyes sweeping the block, the houses, the lake. Everything was as it should be. Calm. Ordered. Controlled not through threats or anger, but through strategic silence and foresight. Karen realized that in trying to assert power, she had played right into the narrator's hands. Every action she had taken, every plan she had formed, had been anticipated. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sound of leaves brushing together, a quiet applause, almost, for the lesson learned. Karen slowly stood up, still shaken, still humbled, knowing that her attempts to dominate the situation had failed completely. The narrator watched her, calm and patient. They had not needed to yell, to argue, or to confront. The lesson had delivered itself through observation, patience, and timing. Karen's obsession had become her undoing, and the narrator's quiet mastery had remained intact. As night fell, the neighborhood returned to its serene rhythm. Lights flickered on in the houses, the lake glimmered under the moon, and a sense of peace settled over Maplewood. Karen quietly walked away, finally accepting her defeat. And the narrator? They returned to the porch, picking up their coffee once again. Calm. Serene. In control. Every small movement deliberate, every word measured. They had faced the storm of obsession, arrogance, and confrontation and had emerged untouched, victorious, and in full command. For the audience, the story left a lingering truth: power is not always loud, dominance is not always visible, and sometimes, the quietest, most patient person holds more control than anyone could imagine. The lake rippled once more, reflecting the moonlight, as if the neighborhood itself acknowledged the balance restored. Maplewood would never forget that day, not because of conflict, but because of the quiet mastery of someone who understood that true power often lies in stillness, observation, and timing. The last words lingered in the air, soft yet profound. Sometimes, the person who says nothing is the one who owns everything. And with that, the narrator sat back, sipping their coffee, watching the world unfold exactly as it should. If you liked the video, please like, share, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.